The Dodgers, after Sunday's game, they made a big number of spring training roster cuts, and this is par for the course every year. It's all part of the process of getting your roster ultimately down to 26 players for opening day. So the initial announcement was that Andy Pages, Landon Knack, Diego Cartaya, Hunter Fiducia, Ricky Vanasco, and Nick Frasso were all optioned to minor league camp. In addition, Steven Gonzalez, I believe is how you say his name. Jesse, is it Han or Han?
I think it's Han.
Jesse Hahn, Michael Peterson, Eduardo Salazar, and Travis Swaggerty were reassigned to minor league camp. Then a couple hours later, after that announcement was made, the Dodgers also said that River Ryan was reassigned as well. And if you're wondering kind of about the difference in sort of terminology here, players on the 40-man roster who get quote-unquote optioned to minor league camp. Those who aren't part of it get reassigned. So that's basically the only difference. And one important thing to keep in mind, because I did see a lot of this after, we put up our article, these players can all still participate in Cactus League games and spring training games. So just because they've been sent to minor league camp doesn't mean that they're prohibited from participating. But Blake, let's kind of just start from the beginning. What was your reaction to sort of the first, I guess if you want to call it 2 rounds of roster cuts or just one big round?
Yeah, I think we'll just go with the one big round. The Dodgers were just a little late on the River Ryan one for whatever reason, but my immediate reaction was I wasn't really surprised by any of them. I know Pages was the one that grabbed headlines, but he was never making the roster, like regardless of what he did this spring. The Dodgers have a full 26-man roster. He's played one game above AA, and he tore his shoulder in that game, and he's still kind of rehabbing his way back, so there just wasn't a spot for him. The Dodgers aren't going to rush him. He wasn't going to make the roster. So that didn't really surprise me at all. I don't think there's anything to do with timing of it or anything. It's just they're getting ready for the season, and that's how they go about it. The one I was maybe a little surprised about was Ricky Vanasco, because they gave him the major league deal in the offseason, and he did look pretty impressive. But again, with him, it's still another situation where the roster's just so full. Like, we've already talked about it multiple times, how who's going to be the last man left out of the bullpen. Like, you have essentially 9 or 10 players for 7 or 8 bullpen spots. So it just would have been hard for him to make the roster. Landon Knack was in the conversation for the 5th spot in the rotation at the beginning of the year, but seemed like he kind of faded out a little to Ryan Yarbrough or Gavin Stone. So no one was really that surprising to me. I didn't think anything too much of it besides just business as usual for the Dodgers.
Yeah, I think obviously, like you said, Pages is the one name that really stuck out for everybody just because of kind of the impressive spring he's had thus far. And you mentioned it, he did have left shoulder surgery for a torn labrum last year that happened in his first game, unfortunately, with OKC. And we've discussed it on different shows, whether they were live or sort of recorded episodes that we put up. And I think we both agree, Pages having kind of the power already this quickly back from surgery has been a little bit of surprise and a testament to him. And he's also played well defensively. But yes, like you said, barring, maybe even multiple injuries, because in some regard, Pages has hit himself into the conversation of maybe is it him or Miguel Vargas if the Dodgers need an outfielder. But even then, I think because of the lack of experience Pages has, they probably lean Miguel Vargas if that situation was to arise. So short of, maybe multiple injuries, Pages isn't somebody who is going to be with the Dodgers for opening day, as you explained. And I think, another name that some of our viewers or listeners might have caught their attention was Nick Frasso, just because a little bit of prospect pedigree, but also just a reminder that he's, kind of on the opposite side of this, compared to Pages, because he's not necessarily expected to pitch this year. There was, because he had surgery on his right shoulder, I think for a labrum as well. It might have been a slight tear. And I think it also came out as well that Frasso additionally underwent a hip operation. And so there was some initial hope or belief that maybe he would pitch late in the minor league season. But I think now with the hip operation, that looks less likely, if maybe impossible. And another thing to note too is, Diego Cartaya. We've heard about him for several years. He's already been sent to minor league camp as well. He's yet to get into a Cactus League game this year because of a back injury that bothered him last season. And I think, Cartaya's situation is interesting because he's a prospect that, was on the rise and he was going to be as great as Will Smith was. I think some pundits were, projecting Cartaya to be even better, right? That's not necessarily going out on a limb. And it not only has, I don't want to say his progression has stalled a little bit, but sort of. And now we're also dealing with injury. And so, what do you see with Cartaya? Just maybe not even spring training this year, but kind of looking ahead out to the minor league season.
I think catcher development is one of the toughest ones to project and kind of look into the future. We've seen a lot of catching prospects have been really highly ranked and then they kind of flame out. Of course, we know catching takes a toll on your body and that tends to affect your offense. And with Cartaya having the back injury, I think that might be playing into it also. But I think it's also important to note he was the youngest player at his level for the entire year last year. And I don't think struggles are necessarily out of the realm of expectations for a player when they're that young, competing against much more experienced players is probably the right word to say. Like Cartaya has a lot of raw talent, but that's the thing. It is raw talent and he has to put it all together. It wouldn't shock me if like in a year or two, we see him make a significant jump and kind of figures it out. And it wouldn't shock me if he never figures it out because that's just how it goes with every prospect, but especially with catchers. So I wouldn't be too concerned about Cartaya yet, but it does seem like he's kind of been passed in the organizational eyes by Dalton Rushing and maybe Lozeriano, or I think that's how you say his name.
Like
yeah.
That.
So I'm not too concerned yet, but another down year, it would probably make my concern much higher. And I'd probably put him more in that bust territory than gonna figure it out eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a great point about how young Cartaya is. Like we have been hearing about him for so long, but yes, you forget that he's what, only 21 now or 22 maybe. You want to double check that. We do have Hawaiian Kira asking us. So yeah, I think this year is, I agree with you. It's sort of a little bit of a pivotal kind of. I don't want to be like overly dramatic and call it make or break for him by any means, but yeah, like the Dodgers do have other catching depth in their organization. Dalton Rushing is a name that I see people commenting about. He hasn't necessarily. I don't want to say not looked ready, but he's still learning and growing, and this is a new experience for him as well, getting ready to be part of big league camp and get into these Cactus League games. But yeah, with Cartaya, it's unfortunate the back injury because I thought this was going to be, he was in camp. He's been in camp with the team in previous years, and so it would be. I thought this year, and specifically because he was a little bit older, was going to be interesting to see how he would do. I know you've been looking up how old he is.
Yeah, so he's 22, and to put it into some context, Will Smith didn't make his major league debut until he was 24. And when he was 22, like he wasn't even ranked near the top prospect area for the Dodgers. So I think that's kind of important to note there that Cartaya is way ahead of where Will Smith was, even with the struggles. And that's not to say Cartaya is going to become Will Smith, but that's just how it is with catchers. Sometimes most of them end up making their debut around 24 to 26, as opposed to earlier. Like even Adley Rutschman, he made his debut at 25. And a fact that kind of blows my mind with him is Juan Soto is younger than Adley Rutschman. And Rutschman's a catcher, just came up and kind of took the lead by storm. So that's just how catcher development goes usually.
Yeah. That's, I was going to say, it wouldn't shock me if maybe Cartaya, I think his debut will probably come before he turns 25 years old, but he may not be necessarily, quote unquote, major league ready until he's perhaps 25. And it's not necessarily going to be the end of the world if that is end up being the case. And of course, Will Smith's future and what the Dodgers sort of decided to do, excuse me, it's going to be interesting to sort of monitor moving forward. Really quick, back to Pages. Like I mentioned, Pages and every other player that's either been reassigned or optioned to minor league camp still eligible to play in these spring training games. So we're certainly still going to see, I think, plenty of him. Is there anything that Pages can do to force his way into the conversation, or is the Dodgers, like the bench, just pretty much set?
I think it's all pretty much set. Like you'd be talking about leaving Kike off the roster or Miguel Rojas, which doesn't seem likely with Gavin Lux's struggles and coming back from the injury at shortstop. Like I just don't really see any room for him. I think the biggest thing for Pages this spring training was just about like putting himself in the Dodgers radar moving forward and saying like, hey, I'm ready sooner than you were expecting possibly. If their outlook was we're going to bring you up in 2025 and kind of give you that runway there, maybe now he's an option in the middle of 2024 if there's an injury or something that comes up. There's never really any real path for him to make the roster. And short of him like hitting 1,000 through all his at bats and the Dodgers having 5 injuries or something in the outfield, like it just wasn't ever going to really happen. Because even if they had that many injuries, I think you'd still see guys like Chris Owings, Kevin Padlo, Miguel Vargas making the roster over him. So it just was never a realistic possibility.
Do you, considering what we've seen from Pages, and it's reasonable to expect that maybe he cools down a little bit, but if he continues to perform well in spring training, however many opportunities those end up being, in your estimation, maybe not necessarily with the Dodgers we do, but for you, has he maybe surpassed Miguel Vargas if the Dodgers find themselves in need of an outfielder?
I think it depends on the time. Like if it's in the first month or two, I think Miguel Vargas would still be ahead of him, but maybe around the All-Star break or a little after that, Pages could push himself in the conversation to be that first outfielder called up if they need someone, or possibly even overtake one of their starters in the outfield, namely Jason Hayward, if he struggles or that platoon just doesn't work out for whatever reason. So I just think Pages is more of a guy you're looking at down the line and possibly taking over for a full-time starting role next year than being a big contributor in the first half of this year.
Fair enough. But at minimum, you see Pages making his MLB debut this year.
It wouldn't shock me, but I wouldn't say it's a lock either.
Okay.
So I'd say maybe like 60% chance of it happening.
Okay. Sure, that's something he would take.